While researching for the French Eversole feud, I came across stories of the Marcum wrongful death suit. At that time, I did not know where it fit into the feud series, only that Fulton French was involved. I kept this story in front of me as I knew it was a puzzle piece that must not be forgotten in the stories of the Appalachian feuds. This will be a multi-part saga, as there are many testimonies of the trial as well as confessions given to what was seen and heard during the court investigation. This trial would lead to the Hargis brothers and Ed Callahan facing charges of conspiracy, and with Fulton French of the French Eversole feud being charged with witness tampering, including intimidation of witnesses and encouraging witnesses to make false statements. Come along with us as we walk through one of the most shocking trials of the Appalachian feuds thus far. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. James Buchanan Marcum's widow. We have covered the death of attorney James Buchanan Marcum and how he was shot in the Jackson, Kentucky courthouse. Now, more details about what happened that fateful day on May 4th, 1903 will unfold. His widow, Florence Hurst Marcum, did not sit still while the assassins of her husband ran free on the streets of Jackson. She was now a widow with 5 children, ranging in age from 18 to babyhood, and she was pregnant with her 6th child. And she had a lot of sympathy, not just from the people of Kentucky, but from the people from all parts of the United States. Curtis Jett was serving a life sentence in prison in Louisville, and Thomas White was also serving a life sentence in Covington Prison for murder. However, Mrs. Marcum felt that this was not enough, and it was high time that those that paid and ordered the men to kill her husband also went to prison or paid for the crime. Mrs. Marcum placed a $100,000 lawsuit against James and Alex Hargis, Ed Callahan, and Fulton French for the wrongful death of her husband in March of 1904. The money exchange rate, also counting for inflation, for context would be $24.43 for each dollar in 1904 in today's money. So her lawsuit against the men would be a whopping $2,443,000. This amount of money in a damage lawsuit was unheard of in 1904, and so it was covered all over the USA in the papers. She did not put this suit in the Breathitt County courts where the men had political sway among the judge and potential jurors. Instead, she filed the case in the Clark County Circuit Court. The reasoning behind the case being filed against Fulton French had to do with the fact that he was acting attorney for all of the men that were tried for the murder of her husband. He was known at that time to use men who were willing to lie on the stand to give an alibi for his clients and ordered for them to be acquitted. Because of this practice, Marcum named him in the case for his corruption of the court system. The 4 men charged. Now this was not an easy act for Mrs. Marcum. These were the 4 most rich and powerful men in Breathitt County, Kentucky at that time. She was truly taking on a huge case against them. However, her determination to see justice carried out for her husband would strengthen her through the trial to come. According to the Hartford Republican, quote, James Hargis is county judge of Breathitt County. He has long been powerful in county and congressional district politics. He is a Democratic leader in the state politics, a member of the Democratic State Central Committee, and a personal friend of the political counselor of Governor Beckham. Alex Hargis is a former Democratic state senator. He is a shrewd merchant who, with his brother, has been successful in Jackson and has amassed what, in that part of the state, is considered an immense fortune. Edward Callahan is High Sheriff of Bloody Breathitt. He was appointed by Judge Hargis after an election in which such fraudulent practices were resorted to that the appellate court held the election void and the office vacant. He is a Hargis henchman and was formerly of the clan Callahan in the strong Callahan feud in which much blood was spilled. Fulton French is a man of means who resides in Clark County. He was at one time the leader of the French faction in the sanguinary French-Eversole feud in Perry County. He is a friend of Callahan and the Hargis brothers, and was employed by the Hargis brothers to defend Curtis Jett. He is now under indictment at Cynthiana for the subordination of perjury in the case. It is charged that he procured perjurers to swear an alibi for Wild Dog, Curtis Jett. Mr. French was not in Jackson when Mr. Marcum was murdered, unquote. This particular case will take on epic proportions in the newspapers, as everyone loves a great underdog seeks justice story. And the idea of a widow taking on four of the most powerful men in eastern Kentucky was sure to stir up a lot of drama in the papers. Details of the three prominent slain men of Breathitt County. The Hartford Republican wrote a huge story about the setup for the lawsuit. It would even go on to mention two other prominent men of the community that dared to stand up to the men and were slain for doing so, Dr. Cox and Town Marshal James Cockrell. Quote, Dr. D.B. Cox was marked. It was known that he would be killed. When the fatal shot was to be fired was definitely not known. That it would be fired from ambush was known, for that was the method of those that take human life in Jackson. Dr. Cox was a practicing physician. He avoided as much as possible going out after nightfall, but one night he was called to a sick bed. He passed the stable in the rear of the Hargis Brothers store. The dull report of a shotgun heavily loaded broke the stillness, and Dr. Cox, unarmed, unwarned, fell riddled with a shot. As he lay writhing in his death agony, the assassins approached, took a shell from his single-barrel shotgun, reloaded, and deliberately fired another charge into the prostrate victim. Quote, They've got Dr. Cox, unquote, was whispered. The expected had happened. James Cockrell was marked. It is known in Jackson that he would be shot from behind. It was thought that the assassins would wait their chance at night, and Cockrell avoided going on the streets at night, but rendered careless of detection by the belief that the law would not reach them, the assassins decided to kill him at the earliest opportunity. What mattered is if they should be seen. In this city of sudden death, no one would dare to say that they saw the murder done. Cockrell was in love with a beautiful girl whose home was in Jackson. He knew his danger. She begged him not to be seen on the streets, even in daylight. Quote, Promise me that you will not go uptown today, unquote, she said. Quote, All right, little girl, unquote, said Cockrell, smiling. Quote, After today, I shall not be seen in Jackson. It is cowardly to let them run me out, but if you say so, I shall leave, unquote. Quote, But today, unquote, the girl pleaded. Quote, Don't go uptown today. They know you're thinking of leaving, and they are desperately anxious to kill you, unquote. Quote, I'm just going to make one trip uptown. It's important, unquote, said Cockrell, and finally persuaded her that there would be no danger at midday with the street crowded with people. Cockrell's object in going uptown was to see a life insurance agent and to have his insurance made payable to the girl he loved and hoped to marry if he lived. When Cockrell neared the courthouse, he heard the report of a rifle, and a steel bullet cut a furrow in the red clay road near his feet. Realizing his danger, he started to run around the corner, hoping to get a building between himself and the assassins, but he ran the wrong way and exposed himself to the men who fired repeatedly from the courthouse windows. One bullet bored a hole through the wood pillar of a porch under which he ran. Another cut through the iron roof of the porch and passed through his throat. Another struck him in the side as he fell. The assassins stood looking out the window, seen by many Jackson citizens. Their work was done. Quote, They've got Cockrell, unquote, was whispered. In the city of sudden death, no one dared to say more. Several men who knew that they could not deny having seen the assassins left Jackson immediately lest they should be marked. James B. Marcum was marked next. For 72 days he was a prisoner in his home, not daring to sit by a lighted window at night, not daring to show his face by day. In a woodland nearby lurked several professional murderers with their rifles, moral perverts whose highest mental development was in the training that made it possible for them to shoot a man dead at 500 yards and slink away into the woods after being paid for the work. After living like a hunted animal for more than 2 months, Mr. Marcum decided to leave Jackson. The problem was how to get out of town alive. Friends advised him to surround himself with the women of his family and walk to the station, as even the professional murderer's hand is stayed when he must shoot a woman or a baby to kill the man who has been marked. Through the streets of Jackson one morning came a strange procession. Bearing his youngest child upon his breast, and surrounded by his sisters and wife, walked James B. Marcum, leaving his home an exile. Enemies of Mr. Marcum stood on the streets, and by loud guffaws, evidenced by their contempt for a man who was afraid. There was no danger, they said, but the marked man had been warned of the plot. He knew his danger. After a period of absences in which he found it impossible to dispose of his property and wind up his affairs in Jackson, Mr. Marcum returned, intending to leave in a short time. Again, he kept within doors to escape assassination. Again, the manslayer lurked in the woods, awaiting their chance. Finally, on May 5th, legal business compelled Mr. Marcum to go to the courthouse in answer to a summons. Now was the chance of the assassins. Hardly had Mr. Marcum reached the courthouse door and turned to speak to B.J. Ewan, who stood in the doorway, then Tom White walked out of the door, brushing past the lawyer. Laying his hand on Ewan's shoulder, Mr. Marcum said, quote, "Ewan, I am afraid that man means to harm me," unquote. A pistol shot rang out in the courthouse hall. Quote, "My God, they have killed me at last," unquote, cried Marcum, sinking to his knees as the bullet went crashing through his body. Turning and looking down the hallway, Ewan saw Curtis Jett advancing with a pistol in both hands. Jumping aside, he heard another shot. The powder burned the face of the dying man as the assassin leaned forward and fired another into his head. Perhaps 20 men saw the murderer fire the shot, but none dared to speak of it, lest he, too, should be killed, unquote. While we now have the details of what happened to Cox, Cockrell, and Marcum, this has to be investigated. Up to this point, there had been no arrest made in the story until Kentucky Governor John Cripps Wycliffe Beckham set into motion an investigation into the workings of Breathitt County, Kentucky. Governor Beckham's investigation. The public outcry for these cases was so loud that Governor Beckham had to intervene. This would not be a very simple investigation into the facts of the cases. Witnesses needed to be protected, and law and order had to be reinstated in the town. According to the same article, quote, "But this last atrocity turned the eyes of the world on Jackson." By sheer force of public opinion, Governor Beckham was forced to send 3 companies of militia to Jackson to protect witnesses while an investigation was made. His friend Hargis was incensed, and his friend Redwine, the circuit judge, whose name with that of Hargis had been signed to many petitions for pardon when murderers were convicted in his court, did not seem pleased. But the civilized world demanded that systematic assassination be checked in Jackson. As a result of the investigation, Curtis Jett and Thomas White were convicted at Cynthiana after a mistrial at Jackson, and Jett was convicted of the Cockrell murder. The public was disgusted because no apparent effort was made to indict any save the actual murderers, where there seemed notable theory that they had been hired. Quote, "It would be useless to try to indict anyone as an accessory until there is a change and a new judge is elected," unquote, said Jackson citizens. Judge Redwine withdrew from the judicial race. The step was, it is said, advised by Governor Beckham, who felt that the success of the Democratic ticket would be endangered if he continued the race. Judge Riddle was elected. The redistricting of Breathitt County defeated. It seems that Judge Redwine and Judge Hargis was not finished fighting for the political power that was now slipping through their fingers in Breathitt County. While they would lay low for a short time, they would come out again during the General Assembly to garner support to redistrict the area so that Judge Redwine could once again take his chair over the courts. From this same article, quote, Judge Redwine and Judge Hargis are seen little in the political gatherings until the General Assembly convened. The Democrats in power did not fear to make themselves prominent again, and their fight to create a new judicial district so that Breathitt County could be taken out of Judge Riddle's jurisdiction was a feature of the session. The public and the press belabored the Beckham administration for openly advocating the bold plan of the two political adventurers, and the bill was defeated, unquote. So through the effort of the citizens of Breathitt County and the press, the measure to split Breathitt County off so that Judge Redwine could once again sit on the bench failed. The first continuance of the trial. As we have seen, the Hargis brothers and Ed Callahan were fighting with the courts to keep the trials from happening. They took their cases all the way up to the Kentucky Appellate Court and lost. Now it was time to face the jury and get a verdict. As a way to set in motion a delay, before the opening statements, the Hargis attorney asked for a continuance on the grounds that Judge Hargis was ill. But what would happen next may have shown this continuance to be a ruse for a more sinister reason. Because when the court resumed its session, 3 of the main witnesses for the plaintiff had suddenly disappeared and left town. According to the Citizen, quote, Marcum damage case, a motion to continue the trial was overruled. Winchester, Kentucky, December 9th. After some delay caused by the effort of the defense to obtain a continuance, a jury was secured in the Marcum damage case Thursday. The widow of James B. Marcum is suing Judge James Hargis, Alex P. Hargis, Sheriff Ed Callahan, and B.F. French, all of Breathitt County, for $100,000 in damages on account of their alleged complicity in the assassination of her husband. When the case was called, an attempt was made by the defense to secure a continuance on the ground that Judge Hargis, although present, was too ill to stand trial. The motion was overruled. The remainder of the day was occupied in the selection of the jury. Before adjourning court, Judge Benton issued attachments for Mose Feltner, Sam Fields, and Buck Cottongame, 3 important witnesses for the plaintiff. Mrs. Marcum, in an affidavit, has sworn that these witnesses were intimidated and enticed away to prevent their appearance on her behalf. The article continues to the next day. Winchester, Kentucky, December 10th. As a result of the defense motion Thursday for a continuance on account of the illness of Judge James Hargis, one of the defendants, Judge Benton Friday passed the $100,000 Marcum damage case until Monday. All the jurors are farmers, and all are Democrat except for 2. Nothing has been heard of from the missing witnesses, Fields, Feltner, and Cottongame, who Mrs. Marcum alleges were bribed and enticed away, unquote. This would be a reoccurring theme. Witness intimidation or just out-and-out kidnapping to avoid the testimonies. Earlier, in the Brenton case, we saw that Ewan had not listened to the threats, and therefore his hotel was burned to the ground. In the case of Fields, Feltner, and Cottongame, they would be spirited away and threatened with death if they appeared in the courtroom. So they were kidnapped or just coaxed very strongly to leave the court behind them. We will let you decide upon that one. 2 of the 3 witnesses were found and arrested for not appearing before the court. The third, Cottongame, would appear in court on his own volition. According to the Hopkinsville Kentuckian, the witness stated the following. Quote, Sheriff W. McCord and his deputy J.T. Stokely of Winchester returned in safety from Breathitt County, having arrested Mose Feltner and Sam Fields, witnesses in the Marcum Hargis damage case, who were spirited away. They came willingly and stated that they were afraid of being killed if they testified against Hargis, unquote. So this was a deadly proposition: either testify and possibly get killed over the matter, or stay silent and face jail time for not appearing in court. This was truly a rock in a very hard place for these witnesses. The trial finally begins. The trial would begin on December 14, 1904. The first witness on the stand would be Mrs. Marcum. The Adair County News would give a report on her testimony. There would be a total of 75 witnesses testify for the plaintiff, and just as many would testify for the defense. Mrs. Marcum, the principal plaintiff, was the first witness. She testified that she had 6 children from 1 to 19 years of age. The earning capacity of her husband was from $3,000 to $5,000 per year. She told of a visit from Senator Hargis, one of the defendants, on which he advised her husband to leave, saying that he would not harm him, but he could not answer for James Hargis and Ed Callahan, unquote. So this is basically the information that was given: how much damage and burden would be placed upon the widow now that her husband was no longer bringing in money. What warning did James Marcum have to the danger he was in, and who relayed that message? This was essential to the establishment of her case. John E. Patrick and J.J.C. Bach testimonies. The testimonies of Patrick and Bach are paired because both give statements as to the possible yearly income of Mr. Marcum. Both were together and witnesses of Marcum's assassination. Bach had even drawn up a possible indictment against Marcum for statements he had made in the newspapers. According to the Adair County News, quote, Johnny Patrick, whose brother married a sister of Marcum, testified to the financial standing of the defendant. He said Callahan was worth $15,000 or $20,000, and that the Hargises owned large tracts of land, houses, stores, and stocks of merchandise. He saw Marcum when he was killed, unquote. According to the same source, quote, J.J.C. Bach was with Patrick when Marcum was killed and testified to the same facts. He had drawn an indictment for criminal libel against Marcum for the statement published in the papers, and Callahan and Hargis were prosecuting witnesses. Marcum was killed a few days before the date set for the trial, unquote. Both of these testimonies would be crucial in the case, as they established the income of the defendants, the possible motives behind the assassination, and were eyewitnesses to the crime. Captain J.B. Ewan's testimony. Although the attempt was made to stop J.B. Ewan from testifying by burning down his hotel, he was determined to give his statement. As the man who was standing with Marcum when he was killed, and the very person who firsthand saw the criminals as they were shooting at Marcum. According to the Montgomery Advertiser, quote, the cross-examination of Captain J.B. Ewan, who was standing by Marcum when the latter was killed, was finished today. In his chief examination, he testified that Marcum sometimes stayed at his house, that James Hargis asked if he could take a walk with Marcum and leave, and that when the witness was once told of Marcum planting a tree, Hargis said that he would be planting a tree in another world in a few months, unquote. Captain Ewan's testimony can also be found in the Adair County News. Quote, Captain J.B. Ewan was standing by Marcum when the latter was killed. He looked back after the first shot and saw Kurt Jett standing behind him in the corridor with his pistol in both hands and pointed at the witness, who ran. He detailed several conversations with Hargis in regard to the matter, in one of which he told Marcum setting out trees, when Marcus said that he would be setting out trees in another world in a few months, unquote. So, not only was Ewan standing in close proximity of Marcum, but he was also privy to the threats made toward the life of Marcum from James Hargis. While on the face of things, these two newspaper accounts of what Ewan had testified to look similar. If you take out the statement recounting of the Hargis statement, they are actually very different. The first account tells us that Ewan stated that Marcum sometimes stayed at his house, and that Hargis had asked if he, Ewan, could take a walk with Marcum and leave. Now, this could be seen a couple of ways. Was Hargis also threatening the life of Ewan, telling him that he should also leave town with Marcum? Or was he trying to get Ewan to lure Marcum from the house where they could get a clear shot of him? Both are plausible, but we shall never know for sure which way Ewan meant this statement. In the second account, Captain Ewan tells us that after the first shot he saw Curtis Jett pull a pistol in both of his hands and then fired at Marcum. Then point the gun toward Ewan, to which Ewan ran from the scene. Was Curtis Jett also supposed to kill Ewan, or was this a threat for Ewan to remain quiet about what he had seen? We will leave this matter up to you to decide. Mrs. Buck Cottengame testifies. According to the Citizen, Mrs. Cottengame would testify to what she knew about the death of Marcum. Quote, Mrs. Buck Cottengame told that French saw her since she came here and told her that D.Y. Combs was here to kill her husband and Sam Fields, and that they better leave, which they did. Unquote. For these threats to have been made, it seems that Fields and Cottengame knew more information about the occurrence of the shooting of Marcum, and that Hargis did not want the two men to testify. Also, the testimony of Mrs. Cottengame would set up the reasons why her husband had not appeared when called for as a witness of the plaintiff of the case. Mrs. Mahalia Horde testifies. Marcum's sister, Mrs. Mahalia Horde, was next to testify. Even though her testimony would be brief, it would go to the fear and intimidation that the Hargis family instilled in the community and to those that would try to oppose them. According to the same source, quote, Mrs. Mahalia Horde, sister of Marcum, said that 2 years ago, Alex Hargis came to her home and cursed her and the whole Marcum family, unquote. After Mrs. Mahalia Horde stepped down from the stand, Henry Noble would be brought into the courtroom to face the judge. According to the Montgomery Advertiser, quote, it was after this testimony that Rat Ankle Noble appeared in court. Rat Ankle, for whom the attachment was issued, came to court today and was turned over to an officer, unquote. This action was most likely done for the security of the witness as he testified. Also, to make sure that Noble was also kept from other witnesses so that his story could not change. And possibly to make sure that Noble would not leave until the court proceedings had finished. In a way, this action can be viewed as sequestering of the witness. He most likely was ordered not to speak to any other witness, although the newspaper made no mention of this, but it is common practice in the courtrooms. Henry Noble's testimony. According to the newspaper The Citizen, quote, in the trial of the Marcum damage case, the examination of Captain B.J. Ewan was finished Wednesday morning, and Henry Noble was called. He is a country superintendent of Breathitt County and was a clerk for the Hargis brothers for 10 years. He heard of the shooting when Marcum was killed and rushed out. He saw Tom White go in a side door, fire a shot into the prostrate body, put his pistol under his coat, and walked leisurely back to the Hargis store. Witness viewed the dead body of Marcum, went back to the store, where he found White, Callahan, and James Hargis, and heard White ask what Hargis and Callahan were going to do about that money, unquote. While Noble was not in the courthouse at the time of the assassination, he did witness Tom White as he left the scene of the crime. He also was a witness to what was spoken in the Hargis store in the aftermath. He would also testify to the movements of Tom White and Curtis Jett just before the shooting took place. According to the Citizen, quote, on December 17th, John L. Noble, or Rat Ankle as he is called, was the first witness Friday morning. He saw Jett and White just before Marcum was killed. White came across the street in the direction of the back door of the courthouse. He saw White motion to Jett, and the latter follow him. Immediately after the second shot, he saw White run across the street to the Hargis brothers' store. For a few weeks previous to the killing, Jett boarded with the witness, and Alex Hargis paid his board. Marcum's residence was near, and Marcum was at home, but did not go out much. He knew that Jet carried a pistol. Witness saw several in the house with Kurt Jet. Among them was Elbert Hargis, Alex Hargis, Bill Britton, now under indictment for the killing of James Cockrell. Britton and Hargis were related. The witness was present at the consultation held at the Hargis store, in which were present B.F. French, James Hargis, Ben Golden, and James B. O'Neill, at which the location of Jet and White immediately after the killing was discussed. Witness saw Jet at one point, but Hargis insisted that he be located at another, unquote. And we have another version of the testimony as recorded. According to the Montgomery Advertiser, quote, who said that at the time of the killing of Marcum, he was in the store of Hargis Brothers and heard the shooting. He was told that his brother had been killed and hastening out saw a body of Marcum lying on the courthouse floor. He saw Tom White go in a side door, fire a pistol into the prostrate body, and then walk over to the Hargis store, unquote. These articles are not contradictory. It is often the case when covering an important trial that the newspapers would print different sections that they deem to be important to the case. While the trial transcripts themselves are not available to public viewing at this time, it would be interesting to see what Noble said on the stand in its entirety. Buck Cottengame. Now, something interesting about this character in history. The newspapers call him Buck or Ruck, and his last name is spelled either Cottengame or Cottengame. He was one of the 3 witnesses that was spirited away from court to prevent their testimony. Let's find out what he testified to in this court hearing. According to the Adair County News, quote, Buck Cottengame testified that French saw him in Leslie County and told him that Marcum was meddlesome and that the Hargises would have to have him killed, and that when the Hargises found people in their way, they managed to get rid of them. The conversation took place near where Nick Combs and Joe Everso, first victims of the French-Everso feud, were killed, and French told witnesses that he could get money for the same kind of work that was done at that place, unquote. This was explosive testimony. This would not only state that the death of Marcum was killing for hire, but one of the conspirators bragged about having the money to get the work done, as he did before in the French-Everso feud. It seems that if you were deemed a liability to these men, someone would be hired to take care of the problem that you were causing. The Montgomery Advertiser states, quote, over the objection of the defense, Buck Cottengame said the defendant, French, offered Moses Feltner $1,000 to leave and to take away other witnesses, and afterward Feltner did so and seemed to have plenty of money, unquote. Even though the defense did object to this testimony, it was overruled as it explained why the witnesses were taken away from the court and had to be brought back again. While the men were bribed with money to leave, we're pretty sure that they got the hint that if they did not take the money, then they would most likely be counted as potential additions to the growing list of dead men in Breathitt County. Charles Anderson's testimony. Charles Anderson would be one of a couple of people that would state that James Hargis was in an upstairs window of his store. There would be several to testify that not only Hargis was there, but Curtis Jett, William Britton, Jesse Spicer, and Tom White would also be seen as one of the 3 men. According to the Adair County News, quote, Charles Anderson, a student at Jackson Academy, said that he saw Marcum when killed, and that he looked up and saw James Hargis at an upstairs window of his store with a gun in his hands. Saw 2 others whom he could not recognize, unquote. Could it be that there were more than 3 men in the room at the time? And during the shooting, during different moments, that a different man or men would appear to look out of the said window? Or was there only 3 men in the room? Again, we will leave this up to you, our 13th juror, to decide upon. Mrs. Rebecca Bailey's testimony. In the case of Mose Feltner, he was offered a get-out-of-jail-free card. if he remained silent and unfound during the trial. It seems that he was himself up on charges for the murder of Jesse Fields. This most likely seemed like a fair deal to Feltner, as he had been brought into court through the capture of the sheriff. According to the Adair County News, quote, Mrs. Rebecca Bailey, mother of Mose Feltner, at different times said that she saw Callahan and French, and each wanted Mose Feltner to help them, and they would help him out of the trial for murder of Jesse Fields. As an argument, French said that the Hargises were all powerful in Breathitt County, and that the circuit judge would do as much as they said, that Governor Beckham was their friend and would do what they wished, unquote. Not only did Bailey testify that her son was given the opportunity not to face trial, but she would also testify that because of political connections that the Hargis family had, that it was better not to cross their path or go against anything that they wanted. Testimony of others for the plaintiff. According to the newspaper The Citizen, quote, Hezekiah Combs of Morgan County saw the dead body of Marcum and described the location and nature of the wounds. John Bays, a Cincinnati commercial traveler, was a clerk in the store of the Hargis brothers at the time of the killing. He testified to the location of James Hargis and Tom White at the time and immediately after. He knew that James Hargis and Marcum were not friendly. Kelly Cash heard a conversation between Jet, White, and Mrs. Mary Johnston shortly after the killing, but he was not allowed to tell the nature of it, unquote. At this point, the jury was sent out as the plaintiffs in the case wanted to prove that Alex Hargis was very upset by Cash. This was due to the fact that Cash was an attorney that wrote out a power of attorney for Henry Hurst. This was for a bond for Mose Feltner, who was under indictment for murder. Judge Benton would rule that this testimony could not be included into the case, and that any further evidence of a conspiracy should be done by the testimony of D.D. Hurst. According to the Citizen in a later article, we get more of a complete picture of what D.D. Hurst would testify to. Quote, D.D. Hurst, father of Mrs. Marcum and postmaster of Jackson, saw Marcum as he laid on the courthouse floor, but the sight made him sick and he went out. He met Kurt Jedd at the door, and the latter said that the murder of Marcum could not be ascribed to him. For quite a while before his death, Marcum seldom went out without his child in his arm, or his wife or his sister by his side. Before Marcum's death, Alex Hargis told the witness that Marcum had made a public charge against him, which he must publicly retract, unquote. So with this statement, we now have a motive behind why Marcum was in fact marked for death in the eyes of Alex Hargis. The Hazel Green Herald's perspective. It is very unusual that there is a summary of the testimonies given before we read what the newspaper reported that Cheney and Mann had said on the stand. This must have been shocking testimony to everyone who sat in Judge Benton's courtroom. There are very few witnesses in the newspaper that was given such an introduction. Quote, the testimony brought out in the trial of the Marcum damage suit Friday was the most sensational yet, given by the witnesses for the plaintiff. According to the testimony of Robert Cheney and James Mann, they were approached by James Hargis with the proposition to kill Marcum, but both of them declined the alleged offer. Unquote. Each of these witnesses would be offered a different bribe to carry out the assassination of Marcum. Judge Hargis evidently knew what would entice each of the men to get them to do his bidding. Hargis would brag that he was untouchable in the Breathitt County court system, and that if he wanted something done, then it would be done, without worry from legal ramifications. The testimony of Robert Cheney. Robert Cheney would be the first to testify. It seems that he had been called to the Hargis store for a meeting. Cheney would tell everyone on the stand what happened next. Quote, Cheney stated that he had been sent for by Hargis, and after going to his private office on the second floor of the Hargis store, Judge Hargis offered him $500 if he would kill Marcum. Hargis was to furnish the gun and assistance of Curtis Jett, unquote. We kept wondering why Cheney was chosen for this task. While he might have been a Hargis man, how did they know to trust him? Well, it seems that Cheney did not have the best of reputations in Breathitt County. One answer might be the death of Chad Salyer. According to the Mount Sterling Advocate dated October 14, 1903, at El Catawba in Breathitt County, a drunken quarrel broke out between Salyer and Cheney at a Blind Tiger. Salyer was accused of killing William Estes in Oakdale a few weeks prior to the quarrel. Cheney killed Salyer over the matter. Found in the Evening Bulletin on January 14, 1904, there had been livestock that had been stolen. Both hogs and sheep were among the missing animals. James Riddle and Mrs. Sarah Haddix implicated Robert Cheney in the larceny. When they went to arrest Cheney, he pulled out his gun, aimed it at the face of Deputy Sheriff Joe Moore, and then dared him to move. Cheney was allowed to escape his arrest, but still under indictment for the murder of Chad Salyer. According to the Adair County News, on March 10, 1905, Cheney would be convicted by trial of jury and sentenced to 12 years in prison for the murder of Chad Salyer. He was transferred to the Powell County Prison for safekeeping. We do find it curious that James Hargis did not offer legal help or advice to Cheney, but simply offered him $500 for the killing of Marcum. This really says a lot about how Hargis felt about Marcum, because Hargis would end up paying a higher price for the other deeds surrounding the witnesses than for the murder itself. The testimony of James Mann. We could not find out very much information about James Mann. According to his own testimony, he was in trouble in the court system for an indictment of murder. We could not find out who this was that Mann was accused of killing at the time of this video. However, we update things as we find them, so hopefully this will be also updated. But Judge Hargis felt that this could be a way to get Mann to kill Marcum for him. Returning to the Hazel Green Herald for this testimony. Quote, James Mann said that Judge Hargis had told him that he controlled the courts of Breathitt County and that he would kill Marcum. The charge of murder, which was then resting against him, would be dismissed at the next term of court. These offers were made, the witnesses declared, a short time before the assassination of Marcum by Curtis Jett and Tom White. Mann stated that after he had refused the alleged offer made by Hargis, the latter sent for him again and told him that he had arranged to have Marcum killed, but that he wanted him to shadow Marcum for a few days until the work had been accomplished, unquote. So, even though Judge Hargis had stated that he had found someone to do the job, he still wanted Mann to follow Marcum. We can only surmise that the purpose behind this was to keep Marcum in fear of his life before he was killed, or perhaps to make sure that Marcum did not get the chance to leave town until everything was ready to assassinate him. The testimony of W.P. Hampton. We find it very interesting that here we have the testimony of a banker. This banker was not called into court because of any actions that he had done on his own. Instead, he was called in about the questionable amounts of money that had been transferred into the accounts that may have led to the murder for hire scenario. Returning to the Hazel Green Herald for this testimony, quote, W.P. Hampton, cashier for the Winchester Bank, told of carrying a message to Mose Feltner from B.F. French, to the effect that French and Alex Hargis wanted to see Feltner at the bank that night. Mr. Hampton also stated that the 4 defendants in this case were depositors in the bank. He says that several days ago, Felix Feltner had deposited between $900 and $1,000 in the bank. Felix Feltner is the man that Ruck Cottongang says was engaged by French to spirit the witnesses away last week. Mr. Hampton also reluctantly stated that Ed Callahan had drawn $500 from the bank the latter part of last week, and it had been charged to the account of one of the Hargis brothers. This was the day it was alleged Callahan went to Cincinnati, unquote. Whether or not this money was switched in the accounts between Callahan and Hargis is up for debate. However, the movement of $1,000 and later $500 does line up with the testimonies previously given about the prices made for removing of witnesses and the assassination of Marcum. The testimony of Mrs. Mary Jane Marcum Johnson. One of the strongest witnesses in the case would be Mrs. Mary Jane Marcum Johnson, who was the sister to J.B. Marcum. She would testify that she had spoken to Curtis Jett, and that he had not only confessed to her about the murder, but also that he was paid for it. She would also testify to the fear and stress that her brother was under before he was killed. Returning to the Hazel Green Herald for this testimony, quote, attorneys for the plaintiff made the avowal that Jett had said to Mrs. Johnson in answer to a question as to who killed her brother, quote, I fired the shot, but Hargis-Money did it, unquote. Witness testified that Marcum did not go out on the streets of Jackson except when accompanied by members of his family, unquote. So, by Johnson's testimony, we have a solid link to the idea that the death of Marcum was indeed a murder for hire. A motion to dismiss the jury. The defense felt that there was now grounds for a dismissal of the jury. In layman's terms, this was a plea for the judge to throw out certain evidences, testimonies, or rule that either a mistrial or throw out the case completely. Returning to the Hazel Green Herald, quote, a motion from the defense in the Marcum suit to dismiss the jury was overruled. The famous Feltner affidavit was read in court. The attorneys for the plaintiff made sensational allegations concerning the alleged plan to buy off witnesses, unquote. While we do not have a copy of the Feltner affidavit currently, we can surmise that this was a very damaging document to the case of the defense. From the wording of the newspaper article, the affidavit must have been a sworn testimony to the plan to have the witnesses paid off so that they could not testify in court against them. This was read in court in front of the jury for their consideration in this matter. The testimony of Ned Marcum. Now we have the testimony of Ned Marcum, brother to James Marcum. In his testimony, we will find that he had knowledge that his brother had went to the Breathitt County officials for protection so that he could wind up his affairs and leave the area. He was denied this protection from the officials and no effort was made to stop his assassination. Returning to the Hazel Green Herald for this testimony, quote, Ned Marcum said that he knew his brother made a public appeal to the officials of Breathitt County to protect him until he could wind up his business affairs and get away, but that the defendants made no effort to protect him from assassination, unquote. Who were these officials? Were they Ed Callahan and Judge Hargis? Or could other officials been involved? If not Hargis and Callahan, could they have also been privy to the upcoming assassination and did not want to get involved and possibly killed themselves over the matter? The cross-examination of Henry Hurst. For the first time in court, we have a testimony through cross-examination that would be thrown out for the consideration of the jury. Why? Did the testimony really have any bearing on the case itself? Or was it because the answer was not what the defense wanted? Returning to the Hazel Green Herald for this testimony, quote, Henry Hurst was called for cross-examination and asked when it was that he had the conversation with Alex Hargis, in which Hargis told him that if he continued to board at Marcum's, he would have to quit working for them. Witness said that it occurred more than 13 years ago, that he had worked for the Hargises at a time since then. The court ruled out all the testimony relating to this testimony, unquote. So, basically, we have Henry Hurst boarding with Marcum. There had been hatred between Marcum and the Hargises for some time after the election that went badly. Was Hurst told basically to pick a side? That he couldn't live at the residence of one party if he was going to work for the other party? That the warning of Marcum to the movements and plans of Hargises would not be tolerated? Did Hurst take these statements that Hargis had made as a threat? Would you have taken them as a threat if you were Hurst? After all this, all of the evidence that the plaintiff had to show was now finished. The court then called for a recess for a couple of days so that the defense could prepare their case. The defense case begins. To review, We have seen that the defense had tried to make a motion to dismiss the jury. We are not told the reason the defense gave for this motion, or if it had to do with the testimony given by Mrs. Mary Jane Marcum Johnson, who was the sister to the victim, attorney J.B. Marcum. However, they were not successful in their bid for the case to be dismissed, and the judge of the case ordered the defense to move forward. According to the Evening Bulletin, quote, Senator A.H. Hargis, one of the defendants, took the stand. Winchester, Kentucky, December 22nd. After Judge Beaton overruled the motion of the defendants for preliminary instruction and had ordered the defendants to proceed, the defense introduced Senator A.H. Hargis, one of the defendants, unquote. So first on the stand would be the Democratic Kentucky State Senator Alex Hamilton, or A.H. or Alex Hargis. Who was Senator Alex Hargis? For the first time in the case, we have a biography of sorts given by the newspaper about a witness. We are pretty sure that this was done out of respect, as he held a high political office. According to the same source, quote, he is 45 years old and lives in Clark County, but has extensive farming and mercantile interests in Breathitt. He has been school commissioner of Breathitt County and has served one term as state senator. He is a Democratic voter, his party ticket, and contributes to campaign funds, but has taken no active part in politics for years, unquote. So what we know of this sketch is that the newspaper is sort of making the claim that even though he served as state senator, he was not pulling any political strings to get out of this trial. That even though that he was a member of the defense and did file appeals, he was taking the same legal route that was available to every American citizen. Possible motive. He would testify to the following according to the same source information. Quote, he denied specifically that he had conspired with anyone to kill Marcum and had been a friend to Marcum, and when the latter came to Jackson, he had given him employment and had done all he could for him until he learned that Marcum had stated that the witness had killed Logan Cockrell, who met death when the witness was a boy. The witness told D.D. Hurst, the father-in-law of Marcum, that the latter had wronged him, and for the sake of his family, Marcum should explain or retract this statement, unquote. Okay, so who was Logan Cockrell, and how did he fit into this story? From all we can find out, the only possible person bearing the name, places, and years that fit was Elijah Logan Cockrell. We found the information about who he was from the website Civil War Governors. He was born December 4th, 1823 in Breathitt County. He served in the Kentucky House of Representatives from 1847 through 1848. Cockrell was a farmer in Estill County in 1860. He served as a judge of Estill County Court from 1848 through 1866. Cockrell died November 2nd, 1876. We could not find the cause of death in the records so far. Alexander Hargis was born August 21st, 1859. So at the time of Elijah Logan Cockrell's death, Hargis would have been 17 years old. If we have found the correct Logan Cockrell as the victim of a crime, we do not have a motive or means for Hargis to have done anything to him, even though he was old enough to do so. We think that Hargis was correct in having Hurst to send a message to Marcum to show his evidence or give a public apology for the speculation. However, a person can take that Hargis also said, quote, for the sake of his family, unquote, as a threat to Marcum, that he was getting into matters that did not concern him, and it could prove to be deadly. So, this could have been seen as a motive as to why Alex Hargis was so angry with Marcum and made as many threats against his life if the other witnesses are to be believed. Continued testimony. We will continue with the report given by the Evening Bulletin for the testimony of A.H. Hargis. Quote, the witness did not say that he approved of the killing of Jim Cockrell. Witness had no knowledge of Marcum's life was in danger and had no conversation on the subject with Mr. Marcum, Mrs. Patrick, and Mrs. Johnson, and did not tell, or either of them, that the Hargises would not kill Marcum, but that Ed Callahan would, unquote. So here we have a denial against 3 of the witnesses' testimonies. The question is, were all 3 witnesses together at one place at one time when Alex Hargis told them that the Hargis brothers would not be behind the killing of Marcum? Why would Hargis have named Ed Callahan? Was Hargis trying to lay the blame at the feet of one of his co-conspirators? Was Hargis simply telling the 3 people that he wanted a public apology for the insult and that he would be satisfied with it if Marcum relented? Hargis and Tom White. One of the last denials that Alexander Hargis would state would be Tom White. Even though he could not deny that he knew Kurt Jett because he was his nephew, he stated that he had no contact with either man at the time of the killing of Marcum. According to the same source, it was reported, quote, the witness did not know Tom White until after the killing of Marcum. Kurt Jett was the nephew of the witness, but the two had not spoken since Jett came to the store of the Hargis brothers in 1902, when Jett fired several shots into the ceiling and when Joe Hargis escaped to the basement to prevent being killed, unquote. Kurt Jett had a hot temper and was called Mad Dog or Wild Dog by the residents of Breathitt County. We are not told why Jett fired the shots into the ceiling of the Hargis brothers' store, but that Joe Hargis was afraid for his life over the conflict. It could be possible that even though Alex Hargis did not meet with the men personally, he could have had a third party to contract the killing to allow for deniability. It also could be thought that Alex Hargis had nothing to do with the killing altogether, as he stated. We will leave these thoughts with you, our 13th juror, to decide upon the innocence or guilt of each of those that testify in this case. Ed Callahan called to the stand. Sheriff Ed Callahan was called to the stand as a hostile witness for the plaintiff. What would he say that would either confirm or deny the charges leveled at him by Mrs. Rebecca Bailey and W.P. Hampton? Would he refute anything about what Alex Hargis said? According to the Evening Bulletin, quote, for the defense, Judge Hargis and Sheriff Callahan were on the stand Friday. Winchester, Kentucky, December 24th. Judge James Hargis and Sheriff Ed Callahan were on the stand Friday for the defense, and all the defendants have now told their story to the jury. Judge Hargis was on the stand most of the day, unquote. While Ed Callahan's testimony in the plaintiff's case would be very brief, it is questionable whether this really helped his case with the court. According to the newspaper report, Callahan did testify for the defense as well, but we could not find what he said or testified to on the stand. We can only surmise that he spoke of the same things as Judge James Hargis said later in this video. Testimony to refute Mrs. Rebecca Bailey. When Mrs. Rebecca Bailey gave her testimony, she recalled a visit from French and Callahan to her 2 sons, Mose and Felix Feltner. She stated that the men in question wanted her sons to testify against the plaintiff. For this action, the 2 men would help Mose out of trouble for killing Jesse Fields. The plaintiff then called Sheriff Ed Callahan to the stand as a hostile witness to testify to these events, according to the December 20th edition of the Evening Bulletin. Quote, Sheriff Callahan, another defendant, was also placed on the stand by the plaintiffs. He testified that he visited Felix Feltner at the latter's home in Leslie County in company with Jason Hargis and B.F. French, and they talked with Mose and Felix Feltner, and that the former denied that he intended to testify in behalf of the Marcums, as the defendants had heard. He was not cross-examined by the defendants, unquote. So, why was he not cross-examined? Was it because he was going to be recalled to the stand to make a case for the defense? Why did the reporters of the time not record what he said on the stand? Could it be that it was a repeat of what was stated later on by Judge Hargis? Testimony to refute W.P. Hampton. One of the more interesting testimonies to come from the plaintiff's case was the banker's testimony about the movement of money. We learned by the testimony of W.P. Hampton that Callahan moved money from his accounts into Judge James Hargis' accounts. But what Callahan says here is interesting. Somehow, the amount of money exchanged between Judge Hargis and Mose Feltner jumped by $500. Why? We get more of this testimony in the semi-weekly Interior Journal. Quote, Sheriff Ed Callahan and Judge James Hargis, defendants in the damage suit of Mrs. Marcum for $100,000, were placed on the stand by the plaintiffs Monday. Callahan said he knew nothing of any $1,500 paid to Felix Feltner by Hargis. Judge Hargis stated that he loaned Feltner $1,500 and took his due bill. Unquote. So, was it a loan or a payoff? If it was a loan, was the due bill given to the court as evidence? Did this money come from Callahan's account that he gave to Hargis in the statements given by the plaintiff's witness, W.P. Hampton? If Hargis loaned $1,500 to Feltner, was Feltner then the actual person who paid for the killing of Marcum under the direction of Judge Hargis? These are just some of the questions that we have concerning this testimony given by Callahan that were not answered by this testimony as it was reported. The testimony of Judge James Hargis for the plaintiff. Like Callahan, Judge Hargis would also testify to the events surrounding the testimony given by Mrs. Rebecca Bailey concerning her sons Mose and Felix Feltner. We found this testimony in the Paducah Sun. Quote, James Hargis, one of the defendants, was called to the stand by the plaintiff's attorney. He said that he heard Mose Feltner would testify to certain things for the plaintiffs in this trial, and went to the home of Felix Feltner in Leslie County to see about it. B.F. French and Edward Callahan also went with him. He talked with Feltner, and the latter denied that he would testify as the witness had heard. Unquote. So what was really going on here? Was this a payoff, intimidation of a witness, or was it simply men curious to see what Feltner was going to reveal on the stand? Either way, Judge Hargis knew better than to go to Feltner and speak to him about his testimony. Being a judge, he knew that if this was to come out in any way, that it could lead to not only sanctions, but to disbarment and removal from the bench at the very least. The testimony of Judge James Hargis for the defense. The next on the stand after Callahan came Judge James Hargis. His testimony would last throughout the rest of the day. We do have a glimpse of what he said on the stand. According to the Evening Bulletin, quote, he testified as to the killing of Marcum and the events immediately before and after that event. He heard shots and saw Marcum fall, but he could not see far enough into the corridor of the courthouse to see who did the shooting. The shots came from Marcum's rear and from the interior of the courthouse. Shortly after the killing, Captain B.J. Ewan was sent for and asked to tell if he knew who did the killing so that a warrant for his arrest might be issued. Witness also sent word to D.D. Hurst, the father-in-law of Marcum, that if he wanted a warrant for anyone, witness would gladly issue it. Unquote. So, Hargis claimed that he was not present when Marcum was shot and killed. So he did not know who did the crime. He would also state in his testimony that he sent for Captain B.J. Ewan so that they would know who to arrest, because since Ewan was standing right there, he would be the one who knew who shot Marcum. Hargis would also state that he sent word to Marcum's father-in-law, D.D. Hurst, that if he wanted an arrest, then Hargis would write out the necessary warrants. This all made Hargis sound innocent of the crime. But was he really? Hargis would go on to testify in the same article. Quote, the witness did not indicate to Captain Ewan that the latter did not look back when Marcum was killed, nor tell him he was the smartest man in the world for so doing. Great excitement prevailed at the time of the killing, and the witness did all he could to discover the murderer. Unquote. So, let's take a moment here. You had people walking and running away from the courthouse, or better yet, hiding from any potential bullets. All the while, several witnesses state that a man came out of the courthouse in a calm manner and mingled with the crowd immediately after the shooting. Any chance of finding the shooter still within the courthouse has now gone. So, why search the courthouse other than to clear those that were already gone? In his final testimony given in the same article, Hargis would go on to explain why he paid for the defense of Jet and Britain. He would also give testimony as to the reason why he was so angry with Marcum about the statements he had made, but he would still claim that he didn't think about it at the time that Marcum was killed. Quote, witness had no conversation with Tom White the day of the killing and did not see him again until he was in custody. Witness employed counsel to defend Jet because the latter was his sister's son. Also employed counsel to defend Will Britton, now in jail at Lexington for the murder of Jim Cockrell, because the latter is a distant kinsman, and witness believed Britton was being imposed upon. Witness was angry when the statements of Marcum were published and never spoke to him afterwards, but did not think of this just when he saw Marcum killed. Unquote. There had to be more reasons why he paid for the defense of Jet and Britton, because they were kin. Could it really be that Judge Hargis really had Marcum killed? That they had been enemies since the questionable election, and tensions between the two sides had been building? It would not be unreasonable to think that Marcum took one step too far against the Hargis clan, and now he met the price for that step. From what we can piece together about the trial, after the testimony of Judge James Hargis, the trial was once again called into recess for a couple of days for the weekend and would have continued on the following Tuesday morning. This may have been for the Christmas holiday, as the trial was taking place during that time. Where we are in the case. The newspaper, the Evening Bulletin, gives us a great start to how the case was going and how many witnesses will be called to the stand. Quote, Marcum damage trial. The case was resumed after a couple of days of recess. Winchester, Kentucky, December 28th. After a recess of a couple of days, the trial of the Marcum case was resumed Tuesday, and about 20 witnesses for the defense answered to their names. So far, the witnesses examined Tuesday have been clerks in the Hargis Brothers store. They agreed that when Marcum was killed, that Tom White came across the street at once from the courthouse, that Judge Hargis ordered the courthouse searched, and that the searching party found nothing, that Hargis expressed a desire to find out who did the killing and the willingness to issue a warrant for his arrest. Captain Ewan, who was with Marcum when he was killed, repeatedly said that he did not see who did the killing. Unquote. Anyone who has worked in a store can tell you that you generally have more than a few clerks working there. Here, we have several store clerks that directly contradict the testimony of Henry Hurst. They all got onto the stand to state that Judge Hargis had wanted the courthouse searched for who killed Marcum and was willing to swear out a warrant for their arrest. Were these witnesses afraid that they could lose their jobs, or worse yet, be placed on a list of people that would be ambushed? It's hard to say. However, these witnesses were willing to testify that Judge Hargis wanted to find the person or persons who was responsible for the crime. Was this an act of feigned innocence on Hargis' part? We cannot say for sure, but he did call for the courthouse to be searched. Other witnesses. But they were not the only ones to bring up this evidence. According to the same article, quote, the testimony Tuesday afternoon in the Marcum case was not of a sensational character. Several witnesses testified as to the familiar facts to the killing of Marcum, that Judge Hargis ordered the courtroom searched without effect, and that he expressed an earnest desire to capture the assassin, that Ewan declared that he did not know who killed Marcum other than the facts that we have previously brought out. Unquote. Who were these other witnesses? Were they the customers of Hargis Brothers store? Were they present during the shooting? Why did Captain Ewan say that he did not know who the killer of Marcum was if he was standing right next to him? What other facts had been previously brought out that the witnesses were now giving testimony to, without actually standing in the courtroom or having an actual trial transcript? These questions must go, for now, unanswered. The reputations of several members of the witness list for the plaintiff came into question during the trial. According to the same article, quote, several witnesses declared that the reputation of Captain Ewan for truth and veracity was not good, and the moral character of Ruck Cotton Gang and his wife was bad, unquote. Why were the moral character of Ruck Cotton Gang and his wife called into question? What crimes had they committed that made everyone think that they were not trustworthy? Why were they calling Captain Ewan a liar for his testimony? What reason or gain could he have attained by giving false statements? The Breathitt County jurors testify. This was huge. Rarely do you have jurors from one trial willing or even asked to testify in another trial. However, the defense felt that they were needed to debunk the testimony of Henry Noble. According to the same article, quote, several members of the special grand jury which investigated the death of Marcum and indicted Tom White and Kirk Jett for the crime were present to testify that the testimony of Henry Noble on this trial was different from that given before that body. Judge Benton decided that they might testify and that Noble was before it, but that the secrets of the grand jury room be kept inviolate and should not be made public, unquote. So, their testimonies were limited. They were not allowed to discuss the deliberations or what evidence they did or did not consider. They were only allowed to speak to the final decisions and conclusions that they came to as a collective whole concerning the evidence given to them, concerning the matter of Henry Noble. There are many judges that highly respect the decisions of their different juries and do all that they can to make sure that their identities and deliberations are kept secret until after the trial, at which point a jury can be self-identified or they can remain anonymous. Very rarely do we have juries that are willing to speak in cases about what they believed and what they didn't believe in a case. So for the defense to call a previous juror to the stand was interesting to make their case. It is also interesting that Judge Benton allowed their testimony on the stand. This question had been brought before the Supreme Court in 1892 under the case of Maddox versus the United States. Because of the ruling of the Supreme Court, Federal Rule 606 was established. It has gone through many changes over the years. Today, as it is written, Federal Rule 606, juror's competency as a witness states, quote, at the trial, a juror may not testify as a witness before the other jurors at a trial. If a juror is called to testify, the court must give the party an opportunity to object outside the jury's presence during the inquiry into the validity of the verdict or indictment. 1. Prohibited testimony or other evidence. During an inquiry into the validity of a verdict or indictment, a juror may not testify about any statement made or incident that occurred during the jury's deliberations, the effect of anything on that juror's or other jurors' vote, or any juror's mental processes concerning the verdict or indictment. The court may not receive a juror's affidavit or evidence of a juror's statement on these matters. 2. Exceptions. A juror may testify about whether a. Extraneous prejudicial information was improperly brought to the juror's attention. B. An outside influence was improperly brought to bear on the juror. Or C. A mistake was made in entering the verdict on the verdict form. Unquote. So, the question becomes under this rule, would these jurors have been allowed to testify as to what they heard and ruled upon concerning the testimony of Henry Noble? We will again leave this to you, our 13th juror, to decide upon this matter. Court drawing to a close. Before we dive into the pages of the Mount Sterling Advocate, we need to cover the events of the court. According to the January 6, 1905 edition of the Breathitt County News, the jury was given their instructions, and then the closing arguments were made. We could only find the statements made by A. F. Bird, and we can guess that the reasoning behind this was because they were so sensational and made for good reading. But, according to the newspaper, after the instructions were given on Monday, then Attorney J. Smith Hayes would make an argument for the defense case that took the entire day. On Tuesday, the next day, would be a 7-hour-long argument made by attorney A.F. Byrd. On Wednesday, attorney Stevenson would speak on behalf of the defendants. Thursday, the arguments would be given by attorney B. Johnette for the plaintiff and McGowan for the defendants. Friday would be the closing arguments for the plaintiff. The quotes in the remainder of this video will be taken from the Mount Sterling Advocate dated July 11, 1905. The Mount Sterling Advocate's introduction. This had turned out to be a sensational trial. Never before or since had a state senator, 2 county judges, and a sheriff been named in such a huge damage case. For the past 5 weeks in Winchester, Kentucky, in December 1904, the court of Judge Benton was turned into a scathing report of the justice system of Breathitt County. The evidence portion of the trial was now over, and it was time for the closing arguments to begin. Quote, A.F. Byrd declares that the courthouse of Breathitt is a temple of injustice and a clearinghouse for assassination. At Winchester on Tuesday of last week, A.F. Byrd, counsel for Mrs. Marcum in her damage suit, spoke for 7 hours. Picture the man standing at the courthouse door at Jackson when the deadly bullet from the assassin's revolver stilled his voice forever. The building, said Mr. Byrd, where Marcum was so foully murdered, was built to be used as a temple of justice. But since the defendants had come into political power in that county, it had been used as a temple of injustice and a, quote, clearinghouse for assassination, unquote. As we can see, Byrd was not going to shy away from his assessment of the men involved in both the murder of Attorney Marcum, but also in their treatment of the political climate in Breathitt County. Instead of being servants to the county, the men chose to use their positions for power over the people of the county, and those that dared to object were eliminated. Fort Hargis. From this point, Attorney Byrd would go on to describe the assassination and how that there was a den of assassins now in Breathitt County posing as officers of the court, that there was a plot that would play out for the death of Attorney J.B. Marcum, and that he was deemed to die by those that were overseers of the den of depravity. Quote, the speaker painted a picture for the jury, showing the man standing in the front door of that building on that fateful morning, while on the opposite side of the street, in what the speaker designated as, quote, Fort Hargis, unquote, a council was held in which it was decided that the last day on earth for J.B. Marcum had arrived, and that while Curtis Jett and Tom White went forth to perform their duties for which, he said, they had been engaged, James Hargis and Ed Callahan, one the county judge and the other the sheriff, stood just within and anxiously listened for the crack of the revolver of one or both of the assassins that would make the man so bitterly hated bite the dust, unquote. So according to Byrd, even though the defendants had not fired a single shot at Marcum themselves, they were in close enough proximity to the deed to be able to hear the shot to end the man that they were awaiting to eliminate from the power plays, that they might as well have done the killing themselves. A question of justice. Not finished with the defendants yet, Byrd asked the very question that many of the people had been asking for a very long time. Where was the Lady of Justice when it came to the court system of Breathitt County? Quote, the people may ask, unquote, said Mr. Byrd, quote, why some criminal action was not taken against these defendants in Breathitt County. But that can easily be answered by reference to their own statements that they control the courts and state officials, and by the boast defy any action against them, unquote. One of the most scathing of the testimonies was given by Mrs. Rebecca Bailey, that even stated in her own testimony that Hargis bragged about the fact that he was friends with the governor of the state of Kentucky, and that he could basically do as he wished in Breathitt County because of that fact, that he would never be touched by a court because of his political connections. Byrd laments. It is a very bad thing when a Commonwealth attorney laments a case, but it is even more terrible that this lament would be on account that the defendants were also officers of the court. Quote, Mr. Byrd said that when J.B. Marcum was shot down in the courthouse door at Jackson, he, Byrd, had the fortune, or misfortune, he did not know which, to be Commonwealth's attorney of the judicial district of which Jackson and Breathitt County was a part. He said that when he first began the legal investigation of that murder, every means had been used by these defendants to defeat him in his duty, and to keep the law from dealing out justice to the men who, he said, had acted as their agents in the assassination of J.B. Marcum. Unquote. This needs to be said. Mr. Byrd is not in any way to be seen as giving any political statements against the Democratic Party in the state of Kentucky during this time. He is, however, giving statements that these defendants used both legal and political means available to them to try to thwart justice. He would go on to add the following statement, quote, the defendant, Jim Hargis, goes before the jury, unquote, said Mr. Byrd, quote, and boasts of the fact that he is county judge of his county and a member of the Democratic State Central Committee from his district, and in every way that was possible has injected politics in this case for the purpose of showing that he has the confidence of the people of his party throughout the state, unquote. But the very fact, said the Speaker, that he is a member of the Democratic State Central Committee, he threw a shame on that body, unquote. So, as we can see, Mr. Byrd was stating that the actions of the Hargis brothers, Callahan, and French were bringing down the reputation of the Democratic Party by their actions. That it was not the party itself that was at fault, but the men themselves. And by the men dragging their political party into the defense of those actions, they were bringing shame upon everyone that was affiliated with the party in 1904. Who to believe? In his last statement to the jury, Kentucky Commonwealth Attorney Byrd asked this question. Who do you believe, and why? Quote, believe the testimony of the defendants, said Mr. Byrd, and they are entitled to be called Judge Hargis, Senator Hargis, Judge French, and Sheriff Callahan. But believe the evidence that has been produced by the plaintiffs in the case with the, quote, witnesses who were not enticed away, unquote, and they may be called conspirators, unquote. And so, we are asked the same question as we sit in our chairs as the 13th juror. Which side do we believe was telling the truth of this matter? Were the defendants innocent or guilty of the crimes that had been laid in the court of Judge Benton during the winter term of 1904 through 1905? The final observation. The Mount Sterling Advocate makes one last observation of the people who were sitting in the courtroom during this trial. Every day, the courtroom was packed with people who witnessed all of the evidence given to the jury. This is their opinion about how Kentucky Commonwealth Attorney did during his 7-hour-long argument in the case. Quote, his bitter arraignment of James and Alex Hargis, Ed Callahan, and B.F. French, the 4 defendants in the Marcum damage suit, was by many believed to be more severe than his speech to the jury, which convicted Curtis Jett and Tom White for the assassination of Marcum, unquote. The case goes to the jury. All of the witness statements had now been taken. All of the evidence had been shown. The jury instructions were now given, according to the Breathitt County News. Quote, drawing to a close. The taking of the evidence in the celebrated Marcum-Hargis damage case was closed last Saturday. On Monday, after the instructions were read to the jury, J. Smith Hayes consumed the entire day in arguing the case for the defendants. He was followed by A. Floyd Byrd, who took all day Tuesday in presenting the plaintiff's side of the case. On Wednesday, Attorney Stevenson spoke for the defendants and Attorney B. S. Jewlett for the plaintiff and McGowan for the defendant occupied all of Thursday. C. J. Bronston is making the closing argument for the plaintiff today, Friday. The case has been on trial for 5 weeks and is attracting a great deal of attention. The courthouse has been crowded at every session since the trial commenced, unquote. As we stated in our last video, the attorneys had gone before the jury and taken a week for their closing arguments. It was now time for deliberation of the facts in the Marcum-Hargis damage case. The citizens of the United States were now on the edge of their seats, as the landmark case was now finally being decided. Possible mistrial. The case was finally in the hands of the jury, and this did not go smoothly. Just 2.5 hours into the deliberations, the jury was having issues. This is how Judge Benton helped his hopelessly deadlocked jury. On this matter, the Birmingham Age Herald reported, quote, "Jurors cannot agree. Judge Benton, however, refuses to discharge them." Winchester, Kentucky, January 7th. The testimony in the Hargis-Marcum damage suit was finished, and the case was given to the jury this afternoon. After deliberating several hours, they came into court and reported that they were unable to agree. Judge Benton refused to discharge the jurors and placed them in the hands of the sheriff and adjourned court until Monday. If the present trial ends in failure to agree, he will try the case again during the summer term, probably in July, as it consumes more time than is allotted to a regular term, unquote. The Big Sandy News would give a possible reason for the jury deadlock. Quote, "After deliberating for 2.5 hours, the jury in the Marcum damage case was called by Judge Benton, and the court was adjourned until Monday. The indications are that the jury is hopelessly disagreed and that the case will have to be tried again." The closing argument made by Attorney Bronson was a scathing arraignment of the defendants for the conditions existing in Breathitt County at the time Marcum was killed, unquote. So, was it because the plaintiff's attorneys and what they said that was really going on in Breathitt County, Kentucky, that caused the jurors to disagree? We can only speculate that it was a real possibility. We currently do not have a copy of what Attorney Bronson said to the jury, but it must have been something else for the jury to be deadlocked over it. The judge did not want to have to retry this case again, as it took 5 weeks, 2 weeks longer than expected, to present all of the testimony and witnesses. So Judge Benton adjourned the court until the following Monday, with placing of the jury in the custody of the sheriff. The verdict. When the jury returned on Monday, they had a verdict. It was really more of a compromise than the actual laying down of the law, as the criminal side of this case would begin soon. According to the Daily Public Ledger, quote, "The jury in the Marcum case at Winchester returned a verdict for $8,000 against James Hargis and Ed Callahan jointly, and exonerated Alex Hargis and B.F. French from any connection with the alleged conspiracy to kill James B. Marcum. The plaintiff will appeal from the judgment in favor of Alex Hargis and B.F. French, and the defendants James Hargis and B.F. French is supposed to be Ed Callahan, as he was the co-defendant that was charged by the jury, will probably appeal from the verdict against them, unquote." Adding to this, the Bee continued this story, quote, "It is announced that the defendants will now be indicted on the charge of conspiracy for the death of James B. Marcum, and that they will be prosecuted on this charge," unquote. The amount of $8,000 may seem very small, but if you were to take into account the money exchanged from 1905 until January 2024, that amount would be as much as $248,122.10. accounting for the cumulative rate of inflation at 3,001.5%. This estimate does vary depending on the inflation calculator that is used. Concerning the trials from this point forward, several of the defendants will face charges of jury and witness tampering, bribery, and coercion. They will also face trial concerning the death of Town Marshal James Cockrell. The appeal. Even though the jury had made its decision, neither side was very happy about it, and took the case to the appellate court of the state of Kentucky. This was allowed, as Mrs. Marcum was not happy that Alex Hargis and B.F. French were also not named in the verdict. James Hargis and Ed Callahan felt that it was unfair that they were named, and this should have been an acquittal. According to the Bourbon News, quote, "The Marcum case. The jury awarded her $8,000 against Judge Hargis and Callahan. They had been granted an appeal from this verdict to the Court of Appeals. Mrs. Marcum was also granted an appeal of the case, as it also affected Senator Hargis and Judge B.F. French. Curtis Jett, nephew of Hargis brothers, is serving a life sentence for the murder of Marcum. An appeal is pending in the case of the death sentence imposed for the assassination of Cockrell. Tom White is under life sentence for killing Marcum. Pending a decision of the Court of Appeals on a motion for rehearing, he is in jail at Covington, unquote. While there would be an appeals case, there would be no new trial. According to the Mount Sterling Advocate, quote, no new trial. Motions overruled in the Marcum-Hargis damage suit. An appeal in each case is allowed. At Winchester, Kentucky, Judge Benton overruled the motion of both plaintiffs and defendants for new trials in the Marcum-Hargis damage suit, and an appeal in each case was granted and all parties given until April. He said he saw no reasons to change the rulings of the court or the instructions to the jury in any save minor points. He said if B.F. French was guilty of bribing or enticing witnesses away from the jurisdiction of the court, as contended by the plaintiffs, his conduct was most reprehensible, and the matter would be thoroughly investigated, unquote. This would happen as B.F. French would go before the court in Cynthiana to be judged for the crimes of bribing and enticing witnesses away, and also for witness and jury tampering, which will start off the criminal side of the trials in next week's video. The appellate court rules. In the middle of October in 1907, the final verdict in the Marcum damage case would be handed down by the Kentucky Court of Appeals. This was a victory for Marcum, as the jury's decision held and was not overturned. We are given the report by the Washington Times. Quote, Lexington, Kentucky, October 19th. Miss Aubrella Marcum of Jackson, Breathitt County, has been given judgment in the Kentucky Court of Appeals against Judge James Hargis and Sheriff Edward Callahan of Breathitt County for $8,000 in damages. Mrs. Marcum had sued Judge James Hargis, Alex Hargis, B. Fulton French, and Edward Callahan for $100,000 damages for alleged responsibility for the assassination of her husband, James B. Marcum, who was shot to death at the courthouse door in Jackson, May 4, 1903, unquote. Later in the same article, quote, sends his check. Judge James Hargis of Breathitt County today sent a check for $5,600 to Bird and Jolette, attorneys for Mrs. Aubrella Marcum, as a part of payment for the $8,000 verdict which Mrs. Marcum obtained in Clark County Circuit Court against Judge Hargis and Sheriff Callahan for $100,000, claiming that these men had her husband, James Marcum, assassinated, unquote. So, according to the Kentucky State of Appeals, the verdict held. We have always said that you, as the 13th juror, should make up your own minds when it comes to a case. We present all of the available information that we can find concerning the case and try our best to present it in a neutral manner, in that we don't take sides and try not to let our views on a matter cloud the cases. It is our hope that we have succeeded in doing this. What do you think? Should Ed Callahan and Judge James Hargis been found guilty in the civil case and paid the money? Or do you think that B.F. French and Alex Hargis should have been charged? Do you think that the final dollar amount was just? Let us know what you think. Also, one would think that this had finally concluded the feud and everything legally would have been finished. Sadly, this was not the case. Because of the evidence that was handed over in this trial, the criminal cases would soon begin. The first of the cases to go to trial would be against Ed Callahan and B.F. French. We will begin with their charges and what happened to them afterward, beginning in next week's video. Thank you. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian feuds. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.